So prevention and treatment of substance abuse. So as we were doing this so I come from, I used to do drug abuse research. My colleague Rajiv Ramchan, who's the second lead on this, he used to do drug abuse research. In fact, we met as drug abuse researchers about 20 years ago. Ryan Brown, probably not a drug abuse researcher. But we all started to get thinking as we were doing this last study that, boy, it seems there's a lot of similarities. The way people talk about wanting to leave a group, like you can't leave a group, and you leave the group, and then you think about joining the group, like should I be back in the group? Missing the group, longing for the group. I mean, it all had these sort of tells of drug abuse. And so we wanted to think about what is this relationship between drug abuse and extremism. So we wrote this piece. And we're not the first ones to look at this. So we had these ideas looking at it from our study called Violent Extremism in America. This researcher named Simi wrote about it, about the seemingly addictive nature of violent extremism, and I'll quote some things from his report. Someone else wrote about, another colleague of mine, Ann Speckhart, wrote about QAnon followers being this sort of addictive environment. And of course we overuse addiction a lot right nowadays, right? You're addicted to the internet. When we say things like that, right? Are you really addicted to the internet? Is it the same thing as, going in the corner and shooting heroin? So there, obviously addiction is not extremism. We're not arguing it's one and the same thing. What we are arguing is that there might be things we can learn from looking at addiction. And so the first part of this brief, we're going to talk about the similarities. And there seems to be a lot of similarities across the two. Again, they're not the same. But then we'll talk about what might be lessons that we would learn from this. So, and also I'll note that there was one other study that did this that was very influential, similar type of thing. It was a study by a guy named Kessler. In 1997, wrote about the similarity between addiction and diabetes. And that ended up proving, well, we won't be this influential in our report, but that was a very seminal report in helping an entire community of medical professionals begin to think about addiction as a lifelong chronic disease. And when you think about it as a chronic disease, it changes your view about how you treat it. So, anyway. So let's talk about some things that are similar. Conditioned cues. Who was this guy? Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov. So we all know Ivan Pavlov. He got his claim to fame by teaching dogs to salivate in response to meat. And soon he would ring a bell when the dogs got presented with the meat, and soon they'd start salivating when they heard the bell. Right? So it's a conditioned cue. And we know that these conditioned cues are really important in drug abuse. Animal studies, there's a lot of animal studies that look at these things. And one of the models is they take an animal, they get it addicted they get it to press a lever for cocaine infusions. The animal becomes what we might call addicted. It continues to press the lever for cocaine infusions. And then they take the cocaine away and the animal learns to stop pressing the lever. But then they start showing the animal conditioned cues. So it generally might be a red light that had previously been paired with the drug infusion. And now that the behavior is extinguished in the animal, we show the animal that red light, and all of a sudden the animal starts pressing the lever again, eager to get the infusion of cocaine, even though the infusion's not there. But it's a conditioned response. And we see the same thing. Humans also talk about this notion of feeling urges in response to being in people and places that used to be associated with their extremism. As a counselor, I would urge addicts, don't go by the drug house. Not because someone in the drug house is going to come invite them in, but the mere act of seeing the drug house, walking by the drug house, engaging in that process is going to elicit the same drug-driving cues that want you to use drugs. So we also see this in extremism. I think I have a quote here. So this comes from the Simi paper where someone says, reformed extremists report experiencing the itch to re-engage in the street violence. This is what we wrote. Reformed extremists oftentimes get an itch to re-engage in street violence when they're watching protests, when they're watching street battles, the BLM protests, whatever. They're seeing all this fighting going on in the street and they're automatically going back to their old habit of wanting to get in the action. Another guy from the Simi paper argues, because he did a bunch of interviews, says, I can't watch like old war movies or Inglourious Bastards or something like that, because they show like the History Channel, World War II videos, because they're showing Germans getting slaughtered and stuff, and I still see that. I see the swastika in the background, and I get goosebumps. So we don't know how common this is, but we do know that a certain number of people experience this. And those goosebumps obviously can bring people back into that fold. Neurobiology plays a role in this. We're showing a light up here is of the nucleus accumbens when, and think in this case during an infusion of cocaine. That there are certain pathways in your brain that light up in response to the drug use, that there are reward pathways, the dopaminergic reward pathways that help your body get excited in response to a drug infusion. Some of those same pathways sort of appear to have some indicative role of related to violent extremism. Particularly, some studies have connected a desire for revenge to grievances, activate some of those same pathways. It's not like a full corollary, but we start to see some similarities. Role of stress and relapse is a big thing. Go back to those same animal models. You teach a rodent to self-administer cocaine from pressing a lever. You train the animal to stop pressing the lever by virtue of stopping the cocaine administration, and now this rodent is on the road to recovery. But then you start giving them an electric shock. All of a sudden, that electric shock will lead that animal to start re-infusing cocaine, or at least, again, going back to pressing that lever. So, and animal-to-human studies show the same thing. People get stressed, right? If anybody smokes cigarettes, I smoke cigarettes sometimes, right? The stress can really lead you to sort of pick up the pack and return to sort of that life, right? So, we got some stories here from conditioned cues. So this one guy tells Simi that he's getting in this argument at a Wendy's or something like that. Something like he didn't like the sandwich he's getting. And he then goes into this process of like this sort of really engaged argument. I mean, really getting worked up over this, whatever the order issue was. And the guy says, "Fuck you, you fucking beaner, get the fuck out of my country." All of a sudden, like from this argument about a sandwich, all of a sudden all this white power stuff is just emanating out of him when the person used to think that was gone. That was their old way of life. And it just sort of spontaneously appears in this case. And he yells white power, and he walked out and threw a Hail Hitler sign. And he says, "I don't do that shit anymore, but I was so angry, and it's because of everything that's going on now, and I did it, and I was walking out. I don't even remember I said it. I was so angry. No, all I saw was red, and I saw her, and I wanted to beat the piss out of her." So, again, individual, recovered, but all of a sudden getting quickly drawn back into that, in part because of the stress. So, features of a chronic disease. So substance addiction, it's well known right now, substance addiction is a chronic disease, particularly like heroin addiction, where people, you can name what, I won't go into the reasons, but for the reasons that exist, people get drawn into heroin and it's hard to leave. And there's multiple relapses that exist in the course of a heroin addict's treatment life, which is now why it's generally presumed treatment is that you're just going to put them on methadone for as long as they're willing to stay on methadone. You can put them on methadone, it removes, which is an opiate. It's a long-acting opiate versus a short-acting heroin opiate. It removes their need to self-administer heroin, or it allows them to function in society, and to continue their treatment in that way. So, how does this relate to extremism? Well, just this notion that a lot of the people that we talk to just have these sort of common urges to go back. Like, they're done with it, they leave, they de-radicalize, but they still think about going back. And what many of the folks told us is this need for this continuous engagement, this continuous treatment, so to speak, of building relationships with other formers, of having family and friends offer support. It's not just like, give me support for 2 months and then I'm good. It's like, let's keep the support coming for as long as we can because we need it for as long as we can take it. Psychiatric comorbidity. So let's see, what are the numbers here? So among those with alcohol use disorder, 36% qualify as having a mental health disorder, including like schizophrenia, affective anxiety disorders, antisocial disorder. For those with a regular drug use disorder, 50% have a lifetime diagnosis of mental health problems, versus the typical 20% for people who don't have drug use problems. So it's well known that those with drug abuse histories, there's high comorbidity of other mental health problems. And it's sort of what we see with this population. Other studies have sort of shown this similarly with extremism. Rates of substance uses in extremists appear high, about 50% or higher. Our studies showed that over half of the sample had mental health histories. So yeah, another similarity, yeah.
Have you done any study as far as dissociation, similarity between mental health addiction groups and then these other extremists?
What do you mean dissociation?
Well, dissociation in terms of dealing with, like, when you're dealing with someone who's got a mental disorder, if they've got a dissociative component, for example, EMDR, prolonged exposure.
Like a personality disorder? Like a
They can be resistant to recovery.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if you've studied any of those nuances in terms of recovery, or even using like a 12-step model type of thing.
You know, nuances are so hard in this field. There's like our samples, like 34, 32 cases. Like there's no room for nuance in a sample of 32 cases. So which is part of the challenge in this field. I think as more and more research gets done, the more nuance you can start doing and start to look at those things. I mean, it's a fascinating topic. And it could be like an important thing.
Somebody has some resources that would
Right? Someone needs to like go out and study that thing. Yeah.
With regards to this, the 50% statistic that you have, I kind of have like the chicken or the egg question. Are they saying that people have mental health problems and then they're developing these drug addictions, or when they have these drug addictions, there are residual mental health problems that are occurring as a result?
Yeah. To answer that question, we need to do twin studies. And I don't know many twins out there that we could use for this. Yeah, we don't know. We don't know. There's no chicken or we don't know if it's a chicken or egg. The research certainly doesn't lead to us to conclude that there's a causal relationship, though there could be. So it's hard to say. Yeah, we definitely don't know if it's causal. Yeah.
So with cold feed programming, you see similar social drivers.
With what programming?
Cold feed programming.
Cold feet?
cold.
C-U-L-T.
As in like
Oh, occult. Oh, occult. Got it.
You see similar social drivers insofar as like when you leave a cult, you're losing the majority of your social support network. But we don't see the similar drive to return to it.
Really?
People want to go back, but it's not a compulsion. It's more of like, I miss my family, I miss my friends. It's not, I miss having to go worship at the altar for 6 hours in a row, you know?
Yeah.
So I'm curious if, in your professional opinion, that's a result of the neurological response to anger and hate, or if that's more related to psychiatric issues.
I don't know. I don't know what it would. I don't know what the cause. I wouldn't be able to answer that question. I don't know enough. It's an interesting. It's interesting differentiation, though, right? That those in the occult don't have this sort of drive to return to it, whereas there's certainly a lot, at least self-reports, where that's the case here. And whether or not there's some sort of like high you get when you're doing these sort of hate type activities or not, I don't know. Yeah.
Do you have any data on what type of mental health problems these current or former extremists may have? Like specific diagnosis?
Like current mental health or past mental health?
Either or.
I think your question is hitting at like one of the challenges in our study. Because we asked people, tell us your story, and they told us their story. And we certainly did not do any sort of targeted questions that would look at, say, diagnostic rates. You know, like the studies that look at past mental health problems in drug abuse populations are very systematic. And I've participated in those studies as a clinician, doing the diagnostic interviews of drug abuse populations to look at their, do you qualify for general anxiety disorder or a major depressive disorder or dysthymia, minor depressive disorder, right? And there's specific diagnostic criteria that's involved in all of those that we would look for in new structured interviews. We didn't do that. So, yeah.
Would you say that these tendencies to go back to those old habits, it's more due to the level of commitment or level of participation in these groups prior to the intervention, or is it a shortfall in mental health counseling? Or?
Yeah, I don't know. These are great questions. These are all like fantastic questions because they're like, yeah, I'd like to know that. But I don't. And to be honest here, right? Like, we did not look at prevalence rates of wanting to return back to extremism, right? Like, we're being very selective in the quotations I'm giving you, and we're trying to like look at the parallels and think what the parallels could be, and so we argue them. But I can't say do 30% of the people that leave extremism have these urges to return? I don't know. Is it 30%, 90%, 10%? Right? We have very biased samples. That's the problem with a lot of this research is very biased samples. Going back to the research on drug abuse populations, that's very systematic research. Done with very systematic populations, looking at prevalence rates, and here we're kind of like sort of mucking in the dirt a little bit, to be honest. We in our case, we did one set of type of interview protocol, and that is asking people to tell us your story, and then they tell us their story, and some people say, yeah, when I was a kid, I was depressed a lot. Okay. Depressed. But that's not the same, I think the field needs to move beyond that and start doing these sort of systematic things to help answer some of these questions.
So, speaking of mental health, you're talking more like depression or PTSD or not bipolar or schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia would be hard because schizophrenia might make it, depending how bad one had it, might make it hard to relate to in some of these groups. So my guess is most of these things are like affective disorders, anxiety disorders, probably a lot of depression would be me hazarding a guess, rather than something more severe like bipolar. Maybe bipolar. You can function pretty well when you're bipolar most of the time. So, and schizophrenics can function pretty well most of the time too. But I've not seen indications of that. All right. Any other questions on the psychiatric side? Social relationships. So social relationships play a big role. And my guess is this is a pretty strong one. We know empirically that social relationships that help drive people into drug abuse. Like it's inherent, oftentimes when you're young, drug abuse, smoking weed is an inherently social act that you do with other people. To get the weed, you have to have some friends that can sell you the weed. And so, there's this aspect to it that when people start doing drugs, they start doing drugs with people that do drugs. And they start hanging out with other people that do drugs. And what ends up happening is over time, your set of world relationships starts to narrow, where you have fewer friends that don't do drugs and would frown on that, and more friends that do it. Which of course makes it hard on the back end, right? So how do you leave extremism? How do you leave drug abuse when all your friends are now drug abusers, and the people that aren't drug abusers you've now alienated from your life in one form or another? And so the key challenge for people who are addicts trying to get out of it is to rebuild their social networks, to start developing relationships outside of drug use and cutting off relationships with those who are drug use. If you've heard me talk today, it's the same thing. We have to be saying it's the same thing that happens in extremism. And so again, another similarity. Geographic determinants. It's an open question what the geographic determinants are of extremism. I'll tell you that one of the first studies that looked at violent extremism by a guy named Seamus Hughes, who's going to be talking at the symposium we're doing this week, showed that folks came from, out of the 250 they looked at, they came from 40 states. They came from all over the country. Many came from populations that were democratic states, right? So that might be surprising to some. It's hard to determine the geographic determinants of these things, but we know, for example, that substance use-wise, that substance use clusters geographically, neighborhoods can have very stark differences in drug use patterns, and all these things correlate with things like income and other things like that. A researcher named Mendita, who himself looked at the data, identified regions of hate, and sort of made the argument that areas with less diversity, again the diversity thing, less diversity, more poverty, and less population change, and less education were more likely to have hate groups stationed there or hate activity there. So again, we see another factor. Okay, all right, so I've got a list of factors. So what's the upshot on this? So basically what we want to do is think about what are the implications of all this, and to us the lesson is all that was just sort of front material, just to say that there might be something we could learn from drug abuse. That's really the upshot of what we sort of went through. So what might we learn? One, early intervention works. Early intervention, drug abuse, we know from drug abuse that early interventions, particularly an intervention called the good behavior game, which is implemented at the first grade level, decreases substance abuse and violence at young adult age. So huge, important finding, and it's a game that's well understood that needs to be sort of expanded. But what if you could sort of adjust this game or adjust a game like it to address extremism? Now again, this is problematic because extremism rates are certainly much lower than drug abuse rates, so that's a problem. Is there ways to outfit a game like something like this with exposure to diversity, or media literacy, or other types of interventions that could potentially help people on down the line? Early treatment. Prevention, early treatment. Externalizing symptoms predict future substance use disorders. So we know from research that people who have externalizing symptoms like behavioral problems, low crime in their kids, hyperactivity, can predict future drug use. And there's a general understanding or value that what if we just treat that in hopes of reducing the subsequent drug use. And so now there's more research and more initiatives going on to start to treat this hyperactivity in hopes that it addresses the drug abuse later on. So again, we know there's high comorbidity rates with mental health issues. So maybe that's an argument for expanding treatment of mental health problems early and getting people in treatment early in the hopes of addressing those for extremism and not just extremism, right? But violence writ large. And there's probably, I assume there's a comorbidity, a co-occurrence of extremism and violence. Anyway, addressing the mental health issues early could be helpful. All right, prevention, structural factors. I mentioned before, so we know there's geographic factors that relate to extremism. We know that there might be lack of exposure to diversity. Segregation appears to be related to it, low income, mental health issues. So what if we can address those structural factors in helping to reduce extremism? And again, this is sort of pie in the sky a little bit because these are sort of big issues, right? This is not a small price tag attached to this. But if structural characteristics in neighborhoods can lead to substance use disorders or extremism, then maybe we should address those structural characteristics. Okay, so what do you do? How do you treat people who are extremist already? So one thing is this notion of, let's see, what's the word here? Acceptance for change, stages of change. in the drug abuse field, and we used to do this myself when I'm a counselor, people come in, they get court-mandated treatment, or they come in on their own. And the first thing you want to do is assess, like, so how badly do you want to change? And sometimes you get the story, sometimes, of course, people are like, I really want to change. Like, my life sucks, and they can list out all the consequences. But other people, they have a hard time naming those consequences. They have a hard time listing out all the reasons they want to quit. They have a hard time seeing the consequence between their behavior, drug abuse behavior, and their incarceration history, or their social history, or their divorce history, or whatever. So there's systematic ways that therapists do to help people recognize the need for change. And my guess is, and thinking about your question earlier about what do you do with these guys when you meet them, and most of these guys don't want to change, probably, I assume, right? Or maybe once they're talking to you, maybe they realize realize they need to change. But as a counselor, as a therapist, I think first thing they would do is help them think about, so what are the consequences of your behavior? Is this really working out for you? And so there's a therapeutic process where I think one ought to go through with these folks to help them recognize the consequences, and then you can help get them to think like, so maybe you should make it, so is it time to make a change or not? Maybe you can move them in that direction. Continuous care. Again, this need for continuous care, this value of someone de-radicalizes is not just, okay, I'm done, next thing. It's, okay, I'm de-radicalized, or I'm disengaged from a group. Now I have to go through a de-radicalized process where I get rid of the ideology. But even then, like, there's need for continuous support. There's need for building relationships with other formers. There's need for family to be supportive, not just now, but in the future. And then finally, this notion for radical forgiveness. I think probably one of the biggest correlates of drug abuse and extremism is they're both sort of the scourge of society, right? And they're both oftentimes engaging in actions that violate the law and could put them up for criminal prosecution. And I think they both suffer from the issue where if people are not willing to accept them, open up to them, talk with them, build a relationship with them, then they just never coming out. So that's where we get to this notion of radical forgiveness. Not that you really have to forgive them all their sins, but you at least need to talk to them in a way that suggests that you're open to them and they want to build a relationship. Which of course is hard because these people have done some pretty bad things. But to me, that's like certainly one of the key ways out, and has been successful in a lot of cases in the past.
Would you target the substance abuse first before the radicalization?
Oh, for those that had both issues? For someone who had both issues?
Because would it be easier to deal with somebody whose reasoning isn't impaired?
Well, you probably wouldn't want someone who's high. You probably want them to not be high anymore. I would say it depends on the drug. As someone who did clinical work in drug abuse, I'd say it would depend on the drug. If it's marijuana and get drunk kind of thing, then you could probably start working on both things at the same time. If it's something much more severe than that, because it depends how bad the drug use problem is and how interrelated they are, right? I mean, it could be that one's addicted to alcohol, and so you're binging all the time, but you're binging within the group. You really have to address both at the same time, I would think.
And for the radical forgiveness, how do you know when they've made that turn? They hit that corner and they're like, all right, when do you realize it's going to be on a clinician, or not getting that? So if you're constantly dealing with a person over an extended period of time, or do you know where maybe the light bulb goes on it?
Right, and there's probably two phases to this, right? The first phase is, it's not about forgiveness, it's about building a relationship with someone so they can get out. Then once they're out, then maybe at that point it's time for forgiveness, but how do you know it's really time to offer that forgiveness, right? That's a good question. There's an interesting story. Jeff Schoep is the director, led this huge National Socialist movement, neo-Nazi dude. And he managed to get out of extremism and start to rebuild his life. But the New York Times really wasn't buying it. And the New York Times basically put on a hit. My read on the New York Times piece was a hit piece a little bit, right? It was, why is this guy out? What's his motivation? What's he doing here? He must have some alternative motivation for doing what he's doing, because no way could this guy really be out. You know, that's an example of not radical forgiveness, because a piece like that, or engaging with people like that, right, can set people back. And it's not that you have to trust people 100% all the time. Take them at their word and at their behavior. But you still should, at this point, the guy hadn't really done anything to deserve that other than this past, right? And too often we want to focus on people's past and attack them for their past and not look at what they're doing with themselves now. So I think that's... So, any other questions?
Dr. Helms, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.